Então, esse é o lançamento do programa que chama Artur Beltrame Visiting Professor, em homenagem ao professor Artur Beltrame, que foi quem dirigiu a Fundação Oswaldo Ramos. Todas essas informações o professor Lachman já tem. O Artur Beltrame foi quem dirigiu a Fundação, foi o líder e que trouxe a serenidade para a instituição durante 27 e 28 anos. Nós estamos completando 28 anos agora. O professor Lachman, ele é professor emérito ativo de nefrologia da Universidade de Michigan. Ele fez a formação dele, de graduação, também na Universidade de Michigan, em Ann Arbor. E ele fez fellowship em Harvard com o Mário, durante quantos anos, Mário? 2 anos. Eles são grandes amigos. E o professor Lachman vai ficar aqui até amanhã, depois ele vai passar 2 dias em Rio Preto com o Mário e volta no sábado para cá. E o professor Lachman, eu participei no programa de Visiting Professor, tem o nome do professor Alan Lachman, na Universidade de Ann Arbor, na Universidade de Michigan, em Ann Arbor. Então, it's a pleasure to have you here again. E o tema da aula dele vai ser, nós temos um programa de cooperação entre a Universidade de Michigan e o Hospital do Rim, a Fundação Oswaldo Ramos, em alguns países da África, principalmente na Etiópia, Ruanda, e agora nós vamos fazer isso com o Zâmbia também. Aqui nós já desenvolvemos um programa de cooperação com o Senegal, com a Nigéria, Etiópia, Ruanda, e agora nós estamos começando a fazer um programa com a Zâmbia. And we have here Professor Emmanuel and Professor Victor, both are from Zambia. It's a pleasure to have you here. They are going to be here for 2 weeks, and they are urologists. They are going to practice the way we do the transplant here. So thank you for coming and thank you for being here with us. O Lúcio vai tocar aqui, então. It's a pleasure. It's also a pleasure to have Professor Teresa Zanella. She's the spouse of Professor Artur Beltrame, who named the program Professor Artur Beltrame Visiting Professor.
Bom dia a todos. Good morning, Professor Alan. Here you have a brief summary of the Professor Artur Beltrame's life. Essa reunião, I'm speaking in Portuguese, but you have in this draft a brief summary of my talk right now. Eu queria desejar as boas-vindas a todos. Esse programa de professor visitante, ele iniciou há 2 anos atrás, essa já é a 5ª edição, mas esse ano, oficialmente, esse programa de professor visitante, ele recebe o nome do professor Artur Beltrame, como um tributo à vida e à obra do professor Artur Beltrame, que, como o professor Medina falou, foi presidente da Fundação e professor titular da nossa disciplina. É uma satisfação receber aqui a professora Maria Tereza, que além de professora titular aqui da nossa escola, também foi a esposa do professor Artur, e também na audiência várias pessoas que foram treinadas e educadas pelo professor Artur, a exemplo da professora Cibele, que está aqui presente, professora titular de nefrologia da Faculdade de Medicina, lá da PUC de Sorocaba. Eu vou pedir ao Renato para fazer uma projeção, e esses minutos iniciais, antes de nós termos a apresentação do professor Alan Lachman, na verdade é um tributo ao professor Artur Beltrame Ribeiro, que a partir de hoje passa a ter o seu nome, em homenagem, o programa de professor visitante, em homenagem ao professor Artur. O professor Artur Beltrame Ribeiro graduou-se em medicina em 1969, aqui pela Escola Paulista de Medicina. Já em seu primeiro dia de aula, em 1964, ele teve uma experiência que simbolizaria os anos seguintes. Sua aula inaugural foi uma assembleia estudantil para discutir o conturbado momento político que o país vivia naquela época. e a partir dali envolveu-se na política estudantil, chegando à presidência do centro acadêmico aqui da Escola Paulista de Medicina, e mesmo diante das investidas contra a sua liberdade nos períodos mais duros da ditadura militar, tanto na graduação quanto na residência, ele não renunciou ao papel de agente ativo na defesa da justiça social e dos princípios democráticos, mantendo proximidade com as lideranças que seriam fundamentais no processo de redemocratização do país nas décadas seguintes. Depois da graduação e da residência, ele concluiu o doutorado em nefrologia, aqui pela Escola Paulista de Medicina, em 1977, e também realizou o pós-doutorado na Cornell University, e retornou ao Brasil para se dedicar à medicina acadêmica e à saúde pública de excelência. Aqui na escola, ele se tornou professor titular da disciplina de nefrologia em 1989 e destacou-se pela visão integradora entre nefrologia clínica, hipertensão arterial e pesquisa translacional. Sua atuação ultrapassou fronteiras, tornando-se professor visitante da Boston University.
Terrible timing.
Em 2005, recebeu o Lifetime Achievement Award pela Sociedade Interamericana de Hipertensão, reconhecimento à sua estatura como um dos maiores líderes das Américas em sua área. Discípulo próximo do professor Oswaldo Ramos, o professor Artur assumiu o papel central na consolidação da Fundação Oswaldo Ramos e do Hospital do Rim, instituições que ajudou a transformar em referências nacionais e internacionais em transplante renal, assistência de alta complexidade, formação de recursos humanos e produção científica. Como líder da Fundação Oswaldo Ramos, desde o início das suas atividades, dividiu com o professor Medina a missão de implementar marcas sólidas na Fundação, rigor na gestão dos recursos públicos, integração exemplar entre assistência, ensino, pesquisa e extensão, e a consolidação do Hospital do Rim como uma das principais forças motrizes na formação de nefrologistas para o Brasil, para a América Latina e para diversos países em todos os continentes, como nós estamos assistindo aqui hoje. Na vida associativa, o professor Artur projetou a nefrologia e a hipertensão brasileiras para além das nossas fronteiras. Em 1981, fundou a Sociedade de Nefrologia do Estado de São Paulo e dela foi o seu primeiro presidente. Foi também presidente da Sociedade Interamericana de Hipertensão. Sua contribuição científica e institucional foi reconhecida com distinções de grande significado nacional, como a Ordem Nacional do Mérito Científico e o assento na Academia Brasileira de Ciências. Para os que com ele conviveram, porém, sua maior condecoração era cotidiana, a confiança irrestrita de pacientes, colegas, alunos, como eu fui, enfermeiros, técnicos e colaboradores, que encontravam no professor Artur firmeza de princípios, escuta atenta, orientação segura e lealdade inabalável. Ele defendia a excelência técnica, a atualização permanente e o estudo disciplinado, mas ensinava com serenidade. Muitos dos que hoje lideram o serviço de nefrologia e hipertensão no Brasil, a exemplo da professora Cibele, que está na audiência, reconhecem nele o mestre que abriu portas, estimulou vocações e compartilhou generosamente oportunidades. Ao prestarmos esse tributo ao professor Artur, celebramos o educador que formou gerações, o clínico que honrou a confiança de seus pacientes, do mais simples cidadão até ministros de Estado e presidente de República, o líder que ajudou a erguer e sustentar pilares fundamentais da nefrologia brasileira, o continuador e, ao mesmo tempo, o criador, que soube transformar a admiração em trabalho concreto e duradouro. O pescador, que vivia nos grupos de pescaria, uma das atividades sociais preferidas, oportunidade para fortalecer laços de amizade, e o amigo sereno e leal, que construiu amizades até o fim da sua vida. Eu, pessoalmente, tenho uma história muito forte com o professor Artur, porque já conhecia o professor Artur antes mesmo de encontrá-lo, e isso diz muito respeito ao quanto que ele representava na formação de líderes, que depois replicaram nefrologia e hipertensão em outros centros acadêmicos. A minha primeira iniciação científica foi na área de hipertensão arterial, na Universidade Federal da Bahia, e a minha orientadora tinha sido aluna de doutorado do professor Artur, a saudosa professora Maria das Dores Acioli de Lima. Então, quando eu vim para São Paulo para fazer a minha residência em nefrologia, eu já tinha na mente que o professor Artur era uma das grandes figuras da nefrologia brasileira e mundial, internacional, e também focado na área de hipertensão. E depois que eu tive toda a minha formação completada, que em 2019 eu prestei o concurso para professor e retornei para a universidade aqui, a Escola Paulista de Medicina, como professor, eu tive a satisfação de ser recebido aqui na Fundação Oswaldo Ramos e no Hospital do Rim, sob a presidência do professor Artur. Tivemos diversos encontros nas reuniões de diretoria, sempre serenamente conduzidas por ele, e no período em que o professor Artur, nos seus 2 últimos anos de vida, eu tive a oportunidade, o prazer e o deleite de ter conversas praticamente diárias com o professor Artur, dividir com ele algumas questões da área acadêmica, de conhecimento científico, e também questões bastante pessoais. Então, aqui, esse é um tributo à memória do professor Artur. Eu queria agradecer a presença da professora Tereza e passar a palavra para ela.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Lightman to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am also very proud of all the work everyone does in this institution, which is very important for me. And I'd like this opportunity to be here today.
Eu convidei a Cibele para estar aqui hoje. Cibele, você está presente aí? Eu gostaria também de que você, se você estiver nos ouvindo, que você também prestasse a sua homenagem ao professor Artur.
Bom dia a todos. Eu não sei o que falar do Artur, gente. O Artur, para mim, foi como um pai na minha profissão, né? Eu já estou com a voz embargada aqui, já querendo chorar de ver a apresentação do Lúcio, de ver a Tereza, o Medina, que somos todos fãs, né, incondicionais do Artur. O Artur teve uma presença muito marcante na minha vida. Ele foi responsável por eu fazer hipertensão, né, por eu, dentro da nefrologia, ter escolhido a hipertensão e ser essa apaixonada por hipertensão como eu sou. E mais do que isso, né, eu tive muitos contatos, como Lúcio, pessoais com ele, e aprendi a conhecer o homem fantástico que ele era, né, a pessoa do Artur, que era uma pessoa muito além da competência, né, tinha qualidades de liderança, de empreendedorismo, de inteligência aguçada. Então, para mim, ouvir falar do Artur é sempre uma grande emoção. Obrigada, Lúcio.
Obrigado, Cibele. Nós estamos aqui hoje com a presença da doutora Ivani, que é presidente aqui da Fundação Oswaldo Ramos. Eu vou convidar ela aqui à frente também para endereçar algumas palavras em homenagem ao professor Artur.
Bem, bom dia a todos. Eu conheci o Artur tem aproximadamente uns 5 anos aqui dentro do hospital, mas eu já havia tido a grande oportunidade de conviver com ele socialmente, porque eu e a Tereza, nós temos uma amiga em comum, amiga da Tereza e do Artur. O Artur sempre me impressionou muito, sabe, Tereza? Pela calma com que ele se dirigia, com a calma e o profundo conhecimento que ele sempre demonstrava. E eu diria que eu sou uma aluna, porque eu não sou médica, então todas as vezes que eu estive com o Artur aqui no hospital, eu aprendi bastante. E eu disse isso outro dia e repito, eu não estou no lugar do Artur, eu não sou, eu estou, porque o Artur foi uma pessoa e é uma pessoa insubstituível. E essa homenagem que nós estamos prestando é extremamente merecida e todos nós guardamos o Artur no coração. Ele foi uma pessoa especial. Sorte sua de ter convivido tantos anos com ele. Obrigada.
antes de iniciarmos a apresentação do professor Alan Lightman, e ainda como forma de homenagear o professor Artur, eu queria convidar aqui a professora Dulce Helena, que também foi discípula do professor Artur, para poder dirigir algumas palavras.
Bom, a Tereza sabe, né, Tereza, que toda a pesquisa de hipertensão, de uma certa forma, o Daí, o Artur, né, sempre me apoiaram. Ele foi, assim, uma pessoa que norteou nossas pesquisas, né, aprendi trajes com ele. Então, foi uma grande emoção conviver com o Artur.
So, you know, that happens sometimes when you go to, when you come to new countries. Yeah, it's you make new enteropathic friends. I'm feeling okay right now.
Até me emociono.
A little embarrassed, but okay. And on time, 8 o'clock.
It is especial com o Daí, e é uma memória imensa do Artur também.
Vou passar aqui, então, a palavra ao professor Medina para iniciar a apresentação.
Obrigado, Lúcio. Desculpa ter saído um minutinho. Então, bom dia a todos. Essa é a reunião clínica da disciplina de nefrologia, da Fundação Oswaldo Ramos, da Escola Paulista de Medicina. Hoje nós temos o grande prazer de lançar um programa, que é um professor Artur Beltrame Visiting Professor, é um programa especial que homenageia o professor Artur Beltrame, na Fundação Oswaldo Ramos, a Fundação Oswaldo Ramos, que tem o nome do professor Oswaldo Ramos, que foi o fundador da fundação. E o professor Artur dirigiu a fundação por todos os anos, 28 anos, 27, 28 anos, ele foi presidente da fundação. Ele trouxe, o Artur não era um administrador, assim, mas ele era uma pessoa que dava uma serenidade e uma harmonia excepcional para a fundação. E a professora Tereza Lanella, esposa dele, que conviveu junto com ele durante todo esse período na Fundação Oswaldo Ramos, e agora nós temos uma nova presidente nossa, a doutora Ivani. É um prazer para nós receber o professor Alan Lightman, que é professor emérito da Universidade de Michigan, na Ann Arbor. Ele teve toda a formação dele nessa universidade, e hoje ele é um professor emérito dessa universidade, e tem lá um programa, o professor visitante, que tem o nome dele, do qual eu participei. Nós temos aqui também o professor Mário Abud, de Rio Preto, professor titular de nefrologia em Rio Preto, que foi fellow junto com o professor Lightman em Harvard, em Boston, na Harvard Medical School, e eles são muito amigos. O professor Lightman vai passar esses 3 dias como professor visitante aqui, depois vai passar 2 dias em Rio Preto lá com o Mário. O professor Lightman vai falar sobre um programa de implementação de transplantes na Etiópia, Ruanda, agora em Zâmbia. Nós também participamos do programa semelhante a esse na Nigéria, e nós, junto com os cirurgiões de Michigan, os cirurgiões de Michigan já vieram aqui no hospital para ver qual que é o perfil de atividade do hospital, que tem um perfil mais próximo daquilo que a África necessita. Então, lá em Michigan, eles fazem cirurgia por laparoscopia. Nós fazemos a cirurgia nossa, um tipo de cirurgia que é mais fácil aplicar, tem um custo menor. Então, os professores de lá vieram para cá, e hoje eles estão replicando em alguns países da África o modelo que nós fazemos aqui. Então, professor Lightman, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for this cooperation that we have between our 2 universities and some countries in Africa that we are starting kidney transplant programs. Thank you. And he's going to speak on kidney transplant implementation in Ethiopia and Rwanda, a joint Brazilian and the U.S. initiative. Thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Well, I don't know exactly what you said, but thank you. This is a tremendous honor. Artur, Beltrame is one of the founders of the profession that I devoted my life to. And it's just a unique opportunity and, as I said, an honor to be able to visit and speak in an institution that he was instrumental in starting. And also on topics that I, as a next generation, nephrologist had, the gift of, his input. And, there's a saying that, if I've accomplished anything, it's because I'm standing, on the shoulders of giants. And I think, that Artur, Beltrame qualifies as a giant, in our field, and somebody from whom, myself, all of you, benefit. Also, this is a cool place. I mean, this is a famous place. It is lovely to come and visit it. Every time I come and visit any place, I learn a lot, but some places have a lot to teach. And, Hospital du Rhum has a lot to teach us all around the world. In the US, there's no programs this big. My program is one of the biggest. It does about 300 transplants a year. That's a tremendous amount of work. I don't know how you do 4 times as much work at an institution as we do in ours, in one field. I mean, I see it, I learn it, but I think until you live it, you don't appreciate it. And I appreciate this place, very, very much. The faculty here have been very gracious hosts to me and very welcoming, and I'm touched. Medina and I go back a while. I first met Medina when he came as a speaker on living donation at an NIH course that I was chairing for the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And Medina gave an excellent talk. I mean, 20 years later, I still remember, that he was a speaker and what he said, and also that we started a friendship that's lasted, more than 2 decades. Mario Boutfilo and I have been friends since 1982. And, he's one of the most important people in my life. We confess that often we just go to international meetings so we can hang out together, and we don't have much interest in the meeting, but we have a lot of interest in continuing our association. On the phone, on Zoom, is Engida Abibi, who's been a visitor here. And everything I'm going to talk about today, Engida was there, at every step. And I appreciate him very much as a colleague. And Engida, as I said a few minutes ago, if you want to jump in and add anything I'm going to say, please, you're invited to do so.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. I will, if there is any, but less like.
Didn't quite catch that, but good to hear your voice. And I see that we have some visitors from Zambia who I've just had the pleasure of meeting. And I'm going to tell you what happened in Ethiopia and Rwanda, and I hope the same for Zambia, because we, and when I say we, I mean the big we, the people who came to help build transplant and the people who received them and worked to build transplant in their countries have accomplished great things and sustainable things. And sustainability is, I think, the most important goal. So having said that, let's see if I can advance the slide. All right. So, for decades, teams of surgeons from the Western world, from Europe, from North America, from places in South America, have traveled to faraway places to perform procedures. And, they'll fix cleft lips, they'll repair an obstetrical fistula, they'll do some congenital heart surgery, or even a transplant. And then they help some patients. Some patients are changed and are helped, but they don't teach, and it's not sustained, and they don't create institutions, and they don't provide education. And more often than not, they don't even let their hosts participate in the surgeries to learn themselves. And then they leave and they come back and they feel very good about what they did and they help people, and it's good that they help people. But then nothing happens for 6 months or nothing happens for a year, and they come back and they do it all over again. And it doesn't build capacity in the country. It doesn't change the country. It's good that it changes the lives of some people, and I 100% support, changing the lives of the patients that they're helping. But it doesn't build. They don't leave a place that's better institutionally or better socioeconomically from what it was when they came. And we've tried to do something different. We've tried to focus on education and sustainability. And it's hard to do, but it's really important. And it takes partners. It takes a lot of partners to do that. It takes partners across disciplines. You need physicians and surgeons, nurses and social workers, lab personnel, and all this expertise that you can bring with you, but you want to also leave behind. And it takes partner institutions because, it's not something like that you can just drop in and do twice a year. You need to be there monthly at least. And, I got a job, and, all my colleagues have a job, so we need to, get all of our friends involved too, so that, institutions like Hospital du Rhin, and the University of Michigan and other places that do what we do well can be there and also receive visitors. And the receiving visitor part is really tricky. And it's tricky because in Europe and in North America, visitors can't touch patients. In some institutions, they can't even be in the room with patients. So what they're doing is they're kind of observing but not participating. But in the generosity of Hospital du Rhin, visitors can participate, and that participation is just absolutely key. So these kind of missions visits I don't think are the best we can do, and I want to talk about some things that I think are better. So Ethiopia, it's a big country. When we started in 2013, actually, there were only 94 million people in Ethiopia. Now there are 124 million. So the population of Ethiopia has increased by almost a third over the last 10 years. It's a poor country. The per capita income is about $2,000, and that's only about 3% of what the per capita income is in the United States. But if you only have the per capita income in the United States to live on, you're going to be struggling. It's the birthplace of humanity. And I'm sorry, I know Brazil is the best place for coffee, but it is the birthplace for coffee. And I will tell you, and Engida will verify that Ethiopians are incapable of crossing the street without stopping for a cup of coffee. In fact, in terms of square footage, one of the biggest coffee restaurants, I think, in the world is actually right in front of the outpatient building at St. Paul's, the hospital we go to, so that every time you cross between the outpatient building where the offices are and the hospital, you have to actually physically walk through the coffee shop. So the coffee, I don't drink coffee, but I hear it's terrific. So I think you as Brazilians, if you get to visit St. Paul's, you may get that benefit. It was never colonized. It was the only African country that defeated an invading European power. And so it's kept its culture. And there's a lot of really, really good things about the Ethiopian culture. One of the things about the Ethiopian culture that's really, really good is it's tremendously egalitarian. They had emperors and they had empresses. The equality between men and women, I think, is unmatched anywhere in the world to Ethiopia. I mean, people have the same respect, the same jobs, the same salary. There's no distinction. It's in a really tough neighborhood. You know, if you look at the countries that surround it, there's Eritrea, and Sudan, and South Sudan, and Somalia. So there's a tremendous immigration into Ethiopia. And while Ethiopia has a lot of problems, you know, if you live in a village that, you know, the entire law and order is a 14-year-old with a gun, you know, and you can get your family to Ethiopia and they can get free education and they can get quality health care, you're going to do that. So Ethiopia, unlike my country, which has been very ungenerous to immigrants, Ethiopia has been tremendously generous to immigrants. I mean, there's a lot of things to respect there. It was a little easier for us as English speakers to be there because education is free, but it's in English. So every child in Ethiopia for many years has been educated in English starting in kindergarten. And most Ethiopians speak 3 languages. They speak Amharic, which is kind of the national language in Ethiopia. And they speak whatever their native tongue is because there's 80-some tribes in Ethiopia and each have slightly different languages. And they speak English. So it meant that when we were talking to our colleagues and meeting our colleagues, that they could talk to us, the nurses could talk to us, patients could talk to us, and we could talk to them. So that's a tremendous advantage. This is Lucy. Lucy's 3.5 million years old. It's actually not Lucy. They made a model of Lucy. Lucy is in some area where, you know, she's protected, you know, by, you know, climate controlled, you know, atmosphere. But we all, everybody in this room, everybody in this planet descends, not literally from Lucy, but from, you know, Lucy's tribe, Lucy's society. To go to the Natural History Museum in Ethiopia and see Lucy is really an emotional event. I mean, I went there, and but then I've taken 15 people there, and everybody goes there, and it changes your life to see, you know, Lucy. So we owe her that, and I'm proud to think of her as my very, very, very distant ancestor and kind of mother. I don't know if you've ever read Cutting for Stone. It's one of the most amazing books ever written about medicine. And it's written by an Ethiopian, and it describes the experience of growing up in Ethiopia and becoming a physician in Ethiopia, and then becoming an immigrant to the United States to, you know, continue training. And I don't want to tell you what happens after that because I've written the book. But I believe every young physician should read this book, and every old physician should read this book if you haven't. So I recommend it highly. All right, so how do we get started in Ethiopia? This guy is a genius. His name is Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. In Ethiopia, people go by their first name. So even though he is very, very important, he's Tedros. People who know him, and Tedros to anybody who's ever encountered him. Now he's the Director General of the World Health Organization. He's frequently criticized by President Trump, which I think is a badge of honor. He's a microbiologist. He helped guide the world through the COVID epidemic. And, you know, his background as a microbiologist is unique in the history of the people who've been previous Director Generals of the WHO, and his intellectual contributions to the field are very, very important to keeping all of us safe. But in 2013, he was the Minister of Health for Ethiopia. And what he recognized is that Ethiopia wasn't perfect, but it had made really important strides in maternal fetal health and in general primary care. And he also knew that there were chronic diseases that were adversely affecting the health of the Ethiopian population. And so he selected a few disease states: renal disease, cancer, heart disease, GI, and he was looking for ways to improve the capacity of Ethiopia to care for these conditions. He recognized that sending Ethiopian trainees to other countries to learn how to treat these diseases contributed to brain drain, but really didn't contribute to the overall health system in Ethiopia. Because you send somebody to Sweden, or you send somebody to France, you send somebody to Canada or the US, or Brazil, and they arrive, as a young doctor, and they train for 5 or 7 years, and they get married, and they're married to an American or to a Swede, and they have kids who are now, even if they're, who are now Swedish or American or whatever, and, then they finish their training and they don't want to go back. They have a new life, they've made a life. So he proposed, even though it would be tremendously expensive for Ethiopia, bring Western experts to train Ethiopian physicians in Ethiopia. And whatever it took, no matter many trips, no matter how big the team, no matter how long it took, to get it done there, so that they'd be training not new Swedish doctors, but new Ethiopian doctors. And one of the initial people, one of the very first cohorts of people who were selected for this program on the Ethiopian side was a very, very talented young surgeon who's on the phone, and that's Engina. Engina has a lot to teach and a lot to learn. We were criticized when we first decided we were going to do this. People said, it's too expensive for Ethiopia. It's not the right diseases. They said, in Africa, the big problem is infectious disease, not chronic disease, not non-communicable disease. But even as early as 2008, it was recognized, and this is so well, the World Health Organization publication, that in fact, even in Africa, that chronic conditions were killing more people than infectious diseases were. And that it was good to focus on infectious disease and that you had to continually focus on infectious disease, it wasn't enough. So it wasn't to let up the gas pedal on infectious disease, it was also to move to a different kind of vehicle and look at chronic, non-communicable diseases. And one of the big triumphs was the management of AIDS in Africa. And the guy in the middle in the tie is President George Bush. And the woman on the end is First Lady Laura Bush. And next to him is Tedros. And this is when they were just implementing PEPFAR, which was the program that controlled HIV infection through much of Africa, and is thought to have saved as many as 250,000 lives. And this was an accomplishment of collaboration across cultures and across countries. Now also, President Trump just abolished PEPFAR, and it's thought that act of cruelty has probably already killed several 100,000 people. This is the life expectancy curves at birth for Ethiopians and for Americans. The 3 lines don't come through, but the blue line on top is women, and the red line on the bottom is men, and the yellow line is an average. And, transplant had developed in the US in the 60s and 70s, but there were so few places doing it until the 70s that the initiation really was, in the 1970s. And what this shows is that the life expectancy is kind of, what do I do with the pointer? Oh, here it is, kind of improving slowly in the United States. Oh, pointer problem, here we go. But it's pretty flat. And it's rising, just a percentage or 2 by decade. But look at the improvement in Ethiopia. Look how rapidly that's rising. And by the time we got in 2013 to Ethiopia, you know, their life expectancy was very, very similar to the life expectancy that we had in the US when I was starting to learn how to do transplant. So, you know, it was a reasonable, you know, vigorous health system, you know, in terms of grading it by life expectancy to make that a practical thing to attempt. The second person who really was key, and this is where luck, you know, you always need a little luck. And this was our luck, Sinayat Fusea. So Sinayat is an Ethiopian who came to the US, and she's brilliant. She came to the US right after high school. And she went to college in the US, and she went to med school in the US, and she became a lawyer also. And now she's the director of international programs at the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation. And I don't know if you people know who Buffett is, but Buffett is a billionaire. He's been one of the richest men in the world for 40 years. And Susan Thompson Buffett, his wife, died pretty young, died like 50 years ago, you know, when she was probably only 40. And in her name, he created a healthcare foundation that focuses on women's health. But in 2013, Sinayat was the vice chair of obstetrics and gynecology. And she was also the director of the Center for International Reproductive Health Training at the University of Michigan, which brings people from all over the world to learn the concepts of reproductive health, even if the law doesn't let them to actually interact with patients. And Sinayat had collaborated closely with St. Paul's Hospital Millennial Medical College in Addis Ababa. And people may not know about St. Paul's, but St. Paul's is absolutely a magnificent institution. You know, the buildings are old and beat up, but, you know, the kind of healthcare they provide there is modern and first rate. And, you know, it has this characteristic of making do with what you got, which is also kind of an Ethiopian characteristic. You know, in the US, if you don't have everything you need, you just get stuck. In Ethiopia, if you don't have anything you need, you figure out how you can still move forward. And it turns out that Tedros and Sinayat had known each other since they were children. And he asked Sinayat if she could identify someone to assess whether St. Paul's was suitable to provide transplant services. And here's the great, amazing piece of luck. Sinayat lived 2 houses away from Jeff Punch. And Jeff Punch is the surgical director of the University of Michigan abdominal transplant programs. And Jeff already had a long history of travel to Africa, but not doing mission surgery. Jeff would travel to Africa because there was a school that his church sponsored in Ann Arbor, and he would teach high school science. And he had gone many times to teach high school science, and he was very comfortable being in Kenya with the Kenyan culture, and also with working with Africans in Africa. But she also, this is just a little circular court, directly across the street from Akinlola Ojo. Now, Ojo is a very, very famous nephrologist. He's also the dean of the University of Kansas. But at the time, he was a nephrologist at the University of Michigan. And he led a multinational, multi-year NIH-sponsored study on the epidemiology and biology of kidney disease in Africa. And he was well acquainted with St. Paul's. And Jeff told Sinayat, I'll take a look. And Ojo told Sinayat, there's no way you can accomplish transplantation at St. Paul's. You guys are out of your mind. So Jeff visited St. Paul's in March of 2013 and thought it might be possible with a lot of development of the institution. And Sinayat and Jeff invited me to her house for dinner, and Sinayat is charming and persuasive, and recruited me to travel with them to St. Paul's for a second opinion. And I thought, you know, it was possible St. Paul's. You know, I'm an old guy. And, you know, the building was beat up. And it didn't have all the services that you'd want. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it wasn't all that different. In some ways, it was more advanced than the Brigham was when Mario and I were fellows. It had things that we couldn't imagine then. It had, you know, pumps to deliver, you know, appropriate doses of medication. We didn't have pumps. It had CT scans. We didn't have CT scans. It had MRIs. We didn't have MRIs. It had ultrasounds that actually worked. Man, I can't tell you how horrible it was to try to do a procedure with own grayscale for an ultrasound machine. And so, you know, I thought, you know, we could give this a try. But here was the status of nephrology in Ethiopia. In the whole country, it's a country of 94 million people, there were about 20 dialysis stations. And probably half of them didn't work. They were all private. None of them were in a hospital. There was no inpatient dialysis, except it was just starting, literally, it was starting a few weeks before at St. Paul's. And for any other institution in the country other than St. Paul's, if you had acute renal failure, you died. It was a death sentence. I mean, holy cow. There were only 4 nephrologists in the whole country. And 3 of them were in Addis Ababa. So, you know, this country, 94 million people, Addis Ababa is a city of 3.3 million. So less, you know, 90 million people had no opportunity to get nephrologic care. A handful of patients travel out of the country for living donor transplants annually. Mostly they went to India. And the outcomes for these returning patients was largely unknown. And largely they were cared for by people who didn't have any experience caring for transplant patients. And it was almost impossible for them to get the medications. And they had to buy the medications themselves, and the medications were expensive. So, well, we don't know what happened to these people. You know, we didn't have a wellspring of people who, you know, who were coming to St. Paul's or coming to any other hospital for care that we knew of. So we can only assume that things were going badly for them. They probably couldn't get their creatinines checked. They probably, you know, couldn't get their tacrolimus or cyclosporin levels measured. You know, it would have been like a kidney transplant experience in the 1960s without the expertise of the doctors in the 1960s. The Ministry of Health calculated that the cost of transplanting 3 or 4 patients was less expensive than the cost of maintaining 1 person on dialysis for a year. So what did it mean to be on dialysis? Well, dialysis was self-paid. So the cost was prohibitive. It cost about $30 to $50 per dialysis patient, US dollars, which is the equivalent of $1,000 or $1,500 US dollars. And no Ethiopian could afford that. So it would destroy families. You know, your mom or your kid would need dialysis. 100% of your income would go to providing that dialysis care. There wouldn't be money to feed the family. There wouldn't be money to house the family. And when your family was bankrupt, the person that you loved or was trying to save died. So, you know, that's as terrible as it can be. There were no fistulas. There were no grafts. There were no vascular surgeons. There were no cuff tunnel catheters. 100% of people dialyzed via just temporary central lines. And so the infection rates were very, very high. Few patients dialyzed more than once or twice a week because of the cost. And many only dialyzed when they went to congestive heart failure and were short of breath. And they would go into the outpatient unit and they get some fluid removed. And then, you know, they would get no care until the next episode, you know, a week later. End-stage renal disease was, you know, a terminal disease. Acute renal failure was a terminal condition. Very few ESRD patients survive 6 months. St. Paul's Hospital, I already said, is a cool place. It was founded in 1947 by the Emperor Haile Selassie. I don't know if you know who Haile Selassie was, but he's a controversial figure. When he was young, he was dynamic, he was a reformer, he was a brave leader. He defeated the Italians when they tried to invade, Italy. But towards the end of his life, he became basically unhinged. And, but he did cause the creation of this hospital in 1969. That's what it looks like. It was 360 inpatient beds, but there were no private rooms. Everything was a ward, and the wards were crowded. The beds in the wards were as close together as you guys are sitting right here. And, if you're in the hospital and at St. Paul's, you had to provide your own linens. You had to provide your own food. Your family had to bring you food. If you needed to have a surgery, you would be given a card to take to the pharmacy, and you would literally buy the suture and the medications you needed for the surgery. And again, it's that Ethiopian courage of making do with what they had, people made do. The first inpatient dialysis unit was just in the process of being set up when we got there. And another act of serendipity. I mean, just you can't believe how fortunate you are. The Egypt Ministry of Health had been sending a nephrologist to various countries in Africa, and he was like a really good nephrologist, but he was like an engineering marvel. And he would set up the water systems, and sometimes that meant literally laying pipe. And he would, set up the electrical systems, and sometimes it meant buying generators and out of his own pocket buying the gas. And he would create dialysis. He would train the nurses, and he would create sustainable dialysis units in the Western African countries. And they sent him to St. Paul's, and he just fell in love with it. And I got to tell you that I kind of fell in love with him. We all did, because he was one of these people who could do anything. And he was just setting up the first inpatient dialysis unit at St. Paul's. And that meant that if you had postpartum renal failure, you didn't die. And St. Paul's had become a magnet for, even though they only had like 3 or 4 machines working, they eventually got up to like 20, but for transfers from all over the Addis Ababa area, for people, primarily for women with postpartum renal failure, but for other people with acute renal failure, because it was their only place they might survive. And then there was also Momina Ahmad. I keep telling people it's brilliant, but these people are brilliant. And Momina had kind of cobbled together nephrology training on her own. She went to Nigeria and spent some time with, she went to Ghana and spent some time with a very well-known Ghanese nephrologist whose name is Charlotte, and whose last name I can't think of at the moment. She went to South Africa and did some transplant training. And then she came back to her home country, but not her home institution. She got recruited to St. Paul's. And she's been to my clinic, and I've been to her clinic. And, sometimes you just know when you're with people who are smarter than you. And, man, Momina's smarter than me. But she came to my clinic, and she understood everything we were doing. I came to her clinic, and I was like a fish out of water. I was so unprepared, because there was no renal pathology. There were no blood tests. You couldn't check an ANA. You couldn't, do any serologies. All you could do was creatinines. And people came in ill, and she had to make clinical decisions. And there were people literally in these beds next to each other, in these wards, getting Cytoxin infusions. and salmeterol infusions, and desperately trying to save their lives and to keep them from having chronic renal failure, because if they got chronic renal failure, they're going to die. And, you know, the clinic would have 30 patients in it. And, you know, I mean, Mumina had a nurse in 2 rooms, and she, you know, and because of the burden of the clinical care, you know, the notes were like 1 line long. But, you know, she did it. You know, God bless her. You know, she did it. Mumina, by the way, is now at the Mayo Clinic, also a recognition of her brilliance. This is a mural on the wall of St. Paul. There's 3 murals like that. And it's Haile Selassie, you know, sort of giving, from when he became unstable, you know, shining benefits down on, you know, his people. And these are lesser people who you may recognize in front of the same murals a year or 2 later. So Jeff made his first visit in March of 2013, and some of the observations he came back and shared was that the health ministry was driving and funding the implementation of the transplant program. You can't do it unless the government's behind you. You can't do it unless the Minister of Health is on your side. And the reason you can't do it is because Hospital du Rhin, you know, it's paid and is maintained by its clinical activity. But there's no way in Ethiopia or much of Africa for the clinical activity to generate enough funds to support the development of a program. Also, there's tremendous turnover in institutions, at least in Ethiopia and Rwanda, and I think in much of Africa, where even if the hospital director likes the idea, he may not be around, or she may not be around 6 months later. And, you know, you need sustainability. Programs where just like a surgeon decides he wants to learn like about transplant or some other skill, and he arranges somehow for somebody to come, they don't tend to be sustainable. And they also don't spread their education. They don't have a mechanism to spread their education beyond just those few people, you know, who are involved. He noted that Mumina existed. I don't think any of us understood how important she was at the time. She noticed that there was a very enthusiastic group of surgeons with interest in kidney transplantation. One of whom was Engeda. So when I said Engeda was there from day 1, I mean, he was there from Jeff's first visit. And, you know, there were 3 other surgeons, 2, one was a urologist, Engeda, and the other 2 were general surgeons. The leadership of St. Paul's was extraordinary, and they were very supportive. The physical facility was, I say it's suitable, but it really wasn't suitable. And it certainly wasn't optimal. One of the weird things is the ORs were all connected. So, you know, because it's so hot, and when it was really hot outside, it was really hot and humid inside. You know, so there'd be circulating air. The walls didn't go all the way up to the ceiling to separate the ORs. So if you're worried about immunosuppressing people and making them prone to infection, that is a really scary place to do an operation. All the rooms, as I said, were wards, and I described the wards. There's no isolation units. Lab, nursing, radiology, and pharmacy services existed, but they were only available like from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. But if you're doing a transplant, you know, you need to be able to care for people 24 hours a day, and there was no way to get an x-ray or get a lab drawn, you know, at 4:05. And you'd have to wait till the next morning to find the results if you drew it yourself. But there was this culture of doing the best with what's available, which was readily apparent to anybody who goes to St. Paul's. And, you know, there's something about the way Ethiopians interact. Like no one at St. Paul's wanted to be the person to keep something, that kept something from happening that was important. So people really, really strove to make sure that they weren't, the block in the road. And Jeff and Sinai and Tedros had these conversations where they shared a vision. And the vision was that surgeons and nephrologists and social workers and nurses would come as a team to demonstrate team care at St. Paul's. And the education would be supplemented by visiting observerships where people at St. Paul's with those same skills would come to other places to study and to observe. And Hospital du Rhin has been really, the anchor for that part of the program and that part of the visions. And the idea was that it wasn't just that the surgical fellows would learn, but the whole institution would learn and grow with the visits. So Jeff and I generated an initial to-do list. One was to pass a law governing transplantation, allowing transplantation. And that was kind of easy because the Ministry of Health was behind it. And, they just basically said, we need a law to make this legal. And the law came pretty quick. We needed to write a protocol, which wasn't that hard because, well, there's two reasons. One was we just took the University of Michigan protocol and we got it translated into Amharic. And they needed to develop a selection committee and an approval process. And the selection committee thing was really fascinating because the personnel at St. Paul's would medically approve a patient to receive a transplant. But there was also the Ministry of Health, which paid for it, and they would approve it for payment. And before they approve it for payment, they would investigate the recipient, the donor, to make sure that they were in fact, they didn't have to be related, but they were at least connected, and that there was no improper compensation, to the donor for donating the kidney, that it was ethical. And that sounds kind of awkward, but it actually worked pretty well. They took it seriously at the ministry. Approvals took a week. We had to reconfigure St. Paul's. There was the implementation of the acute dialysis unit, which was important. They actually changed their lab from being 8 hours a day to 24 hours a day, and staffed it and manned it, and it worked, and it was a good lab, and it's good radiology, and they had people to read, the films in the middle of the night, and that commitment was astonishing. And they set aside clean areas for transplant care, but hadn't found a solution for contiguous operating rooms. We needed to obtain the necessary OR equipment because there was no vascular surgeons or vascular surgery there, so we had to get all this vascular surgery instruments. We had to obtain supplies, immunosuppressive medications, preservation solutions, vascular instruments. We had to identify transplant surgery fellows, and Engeda was one of the first who was identified. And nursing was wholly inadequate. The nurses could probably take a good blood pressure, but not much more. They didn't start IVs. They provided some, wound care, but it was they weren't a call to do a lot. And one of the big problems was that it wasn't part of their job or their culture to let doctors know what was going on with the patient. So a patient might have their, falling blood pressure carefully documented for 10 hours, but nobody knew. And there was no ICU, and there was no ICU nurse training, and there was no transplant program, so we had to train pre- and post-transplant coordinators. There's also an organization of nursing as part of the team, and we had to integrate that. Nurses didn't know how to manage IVs. There was no way to verify that physician's orders ever reached the nurse so that the meds were administered. And there was, although in general at St. Paul's was a culture of problem solving. There wasn't in the nursing. You could be in the middle of an operation and say suction, and the nurse would say, no suction today. There were no crash carts. There was no infection control. And then there was Lynn Reed, that white lady there. And Lynn Reed is an interesting person. She was a conspiracy theorist who believes everything that the MAGA world believed before there was a MAGA world. And it was maddening to talk politics to her. But she is the most loving, amazing teacher. And she began to spend every other month, St. Paul's paid for her salary at the University of Michigan, every other month at St. Paul's for 3 years, the whole month. She lived in the Hilton Hotel when she was there. When you walk in the Hilton in the front door, you know, the people who open the door and greet you, run your stuff through security, would welcome her by saying, you know, welcome home, because she was so familiar there. She is the only Westerner that I've ever met who learned to speak Amharic. And she just had a knack for it. She could hear it, she could communicate with the nurses with Amharic. Every time she came, she would literally come with suitcases full of things she bought herself to, you know, scrubs and stethoscopes and even dressings and things that the nurses need to be nurses. And she taught them, you know, she took these people who basically had nursing assistant skills and turned them into nurses. And the transformation was astonishing. Engeda, do you agree with my description of Lynn?
I agree completely. She was a wonderful, very supportive, intelligent. Every adjective that we have used describes her very well. Thank you.
So then this other remarkable thing happened. St. Paul's got a new, dynamic, young, amazing provost. And in November 2014, he came to visit the University of Michigan, and I took him on a tour. And I took him to our ICU, and I took him to our floor, and I took him to the OR, and I took him to the lab, and I took him to the pathology lab, and I took him down to pathology. And he realized he could not take enough of St. Paul offline to support transplant. So this is November of 2014. By March of 2015, he had purchased and remodeled the hotel next door to St. Paul's. He had already installed 2 modern operating rooms, 4 ICU beds, a 4-bed patient ward, a recipient ward, a 2-bed donor ward, a laboratory for transplantation, a pharmacy dedicated to transplantation, out-clinics, patient clinic space, classrooms, offices, administrative space, and room for 20 additional dialysis stations if we ever use it. I said, Zerahun, how could you do this in 4 months? He said it would take him 20 years at the University of Michigan. And Zerahun thought I was kidding him. He said, if I could do this in Ethiopia in 4 months, it'll take 2 weeks in Ann Arbor. I wasn't kidding him. It would have taken 20 years. That's Zerahun to the right, having a conversation with Medina. And Zerahun is special, and he's part of the story going forward. We then thought we'd give it a try with the pig donor model. And here's what we learned. We learned the backup generator in the new building wasn't reliable. The donor OR rooms were so bright that we couldn't see the monitors for the laparoscopic surgery. Sterile ice wasn't available. There were suction problems or hand port problems. There were retractor compatibility problems. There were surgical stapler compatibility problems, and that the pigs were too big. So we pressed on anyway, and we tried to address those problems. And in September 22nd to 24th of 2015, with the assistance of Engeda on the right and Jeff in the middle, we did the first few transplants with them acting as fellows, but Jeff acting as a surgeon in Ethiopia. And you can see that looks like kind of a modernish OR behind them, and that's part of the new building. So other things are moving along. We implemented nephrology training with faculty from the University of Michigan. The target was for each of the 4 surgical fellows to do 50 cases. which we realized was really a problem because that was 10 visits per year with the 4 fellows, and that each fellow was only able to perform 10 renal transplants procedures per year, which meant that it would have taken 5 years of training for them to get to 50. But it also wasn't as good as it would have been if it was continuous, because when things are done once a month, you know, your skills ebb and flow, you know, rise and fall. And we didn't have a place for hands-on training. But we wanted to sort of integrate them into the world community of transplants, so we took them to international meetings. And at the TTS, the Transplant Society, International Transplant Society meeting in Hong Kong in August of 2018, I was at a talk and I was sitting with Engeda, and I'm not sure which other fellow, but Medina tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Hi, Alan, how you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing fine." He said, "What are you up to these days?" I said, "Well, I want you to meet Engeda, who's our fellow in Ethiopia." And Engeda and Medina had a talk, and Medina said to me, "You've got to send these people to Hospital de Rem for training." And it absolutely made possible our failing education program, because the 50 cases that they saw, and each of them saw in each of their months at Hospital de Rem, got them over the top, got them to the point where their surgical skills could be independent and applied in the patient population. And we wouldn't have succeeded if it wasn't for Hospital de Rem, and we wouldn't have succeeded if it wasn't for the generosity of Medina. And then also Medina and Luca and some students came and visited and did a lot of valuable work at St. Paul's with us, and the training accelerated. And there's Medina giving a public lecture at the medical school that St. Paul's associated with. And it was a good lecture, but it was also, I think, reflected the respect and the appreciation that leadership at St. Paul's had with Medina as a person and with Hospital de Rem as an institution. So I got to speed up. All right. So anyway, we did about 150 live transplants there. They graduated in 2018, the 4 fellows. Then our attention turned to Rwanda, which I'm only going to say a little bit about. Rwanda's smaller. It's similarly poor to Ethiopia. It's still recovering from the 1994 genocide. And there were several transplants done by visiting surgeons, but poor outcomes because of the absence of medical follow-up. Sanayat, the woman who had been the vice chair of obstetrics and gynecology, who had moved to the Buffett Foundation, had continued her work in reproductive health in Rwanda, and she recruited the provost from St. Paul's to King Faisal, and she recruited Momina, the transplant nephrologist, from King Faisal, and she recruited Engeda from King Faisal. And we had virtual meetings on the phone for about a year, and then we made a site visit, and then we started training. And without going through this, because I'm really short on time, the first transplant was done in May 23rd, 2023. The first independent transplant was done by the Rwandan surgeons in December of 2025. All of the trainees, all of the surgical trainees in Rwanda also came to Hospital de Rem and also benefited from the incredible opportunity that Hospital de Rem offers and from the generosity of your institution to developing global health. I think I've already covered the conclusions. I just want to say that you got to want to do it, and you have to have some good fortune, and you have to have good people, and you have to have places that people can come and train and observe. And this is the best place. There's an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And then there's an American proverb. This guy's name is Bo Schembechler. The University of Michigan is the most successful college football team in the U.S. history. It's won the most games. It has the highest winning percentage. Its most legendary, it has several legendary coaches, but one of its legendary coaches is Bo Schembechler. And Bo was known for giving rousing speeches. So this is the speech that Bo gave in 1983. He said, "No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. We're going to work together. We're going to believe in each other. And you will look back and remember what a great thing it is to be part of such a team." And, it's actually true. It's, to be part of the team in Ethiopia, part of the team in Rwanda, part of the team that collaborates with Hospital du Rhin is something that, honor of my life. So thank you. And I have 30 seconds. I still have 3 seconds to go.
Thank you, Professor Leichman. It's an honor for us to have your conference here. And before finishing, I would like to invite Professor Emmanuel and Angela, and also Victor and Emmanuel from Zambia to stay in a room after we finish. But we're going to have some meeting with the people that are online. And before finishing, I would like to invite Professor Teresa Zanella, that was the spouse of Professor Artur Beltrame, just to give the last word.
Yes, as I told before, I would like to thank you very much for tonight's conference and to be here. It's an honor for me and proud of this marvelous institution. And I thank you very much, both for place the name of my husband in this program, very important program you have here.
Thank you.
Então, nós vamos continuar depois com o grupo que é envolvido mais diretamente nessa cooperação nossa com a África, com alguns países da África, para acertar algumas questões. A sessão está encerrada. Muito obrigado a todos pela presença.